Now, while we're talking about friendships that sort of exceed what we would probably consider the closer forms of relationship, that of marriage and family, let's think about David and Jonathan for a minute.
That's one that's perfect for the brother-friend relationship, because they had a friendship that quite literally exceeded in a real way family ties.
Yeah, I think the Bible even says that David and Jonathan loved each other more than they ever loved a woman, right?
It does.
So
yes.
it even exceeded the marital ties, which is strange for us to think today. But you know, we see that it's legitimate, and their friendship in the Bible is a very very touching one. So we've talked a lot about, you know, the wisdom that the Bible gives us in sort of a propositional form. We should get into now some of the examples that we see in Scripture, and David and Jonathan are a good place to start. And as we have already said, Jonathan acted on David's behalf in spite of his father's hatred for David.
Yeah, and just a little bit of the backstory for people who may not be familiar with it in the Old Testament. So Saul was the first king of Israel. David slayed Goliath. He was ultimately anointed to be king, and I think, you know, everybody saw it coming, right? And if you read that passage, what you'll see is that, you know, David had slew Goliath, and he became prominent as a military man, and Saul put him in charge of 1,000 soldiers, and they went out and battled the Philistines, and David was wildly successful while Saul was not so much so. And when they came back, all of the host of the Israelites and the women that were there were singing praises to David and not to Saul, the king. And so that set Saul against David. He always eyed him from that day forward. Jonathan was Saul's son and a potential heir to that kingship. But he and David became fast friends because David did come to live with the king. You remember the stories of him, you know, playing the harp when the evil spirits would come and all that. But there came a point when Saul tried to nail David to the wall with his javelin. And so in all of that mix of things, and we don't know the personality types necessarily, you could study it out and probably discern some things. But David and Jonathan became fast friends. And what is so interesting to me is that Jonathan was willing to give up his right to the throne, which would have rightfully been his in the lineage of his father,
Right.
because he knew that David was the true God-anointed king of Israel.
Yeah.
And so he set aside his own self. We talked in the last podcast about, you know, our self-sufficiency and our self-interest keeping us from friendships. This is a great example of where Jonathan set something huge aside, the right to the throne, to befriend David. David obviously felt the same way about Jonathan, and if you follow the story through, and maybe I'm getting ahead of you on this, but, you know, ultimately Saul and Jonathan get killed in battle, and it grieves David greatly. David assumes the throne, and he basically says, is there anyone left that I can show grace to because of Jonathan?
Oh, yeah.
And there is a son who was injured in the Exodus, Mephibosheth, and he was brought forward. And what normally happens to the heirs of kings in the Old Testament when a new king takes over? Normally they're put to death, right? To protect that ascension to the throne or that claim to the throne. But what did David do?
He had him sit at the king's table.
Exactly. Oh, so yeah, it's a beautiful story. It almost brings me to tears to think about. But he did that because of that bond, right? And so like I say, it's a beautiful story. How do we replicate that? What can we learn from that about how we should conduct a friendship?
You know, the word that is just bouncing around in my head right now is jealousy. I think we could say that jealousy is what separated Saul's relationship with David from Jonathan's relationship with David. Saul was jealous of David. And if there was anything to be jealous of in the world, it would be the right to the throne, especially the God-given right to the throne. But as you're pointing out, Jonathan did not seem to grasp at that. And we really don't need to underestimate the role that jealousy plays in the destruction of our relationships. You know, I just read the account of Joseph, and Joseph was another person who God chose in spite of the human way of things. You know, like in the case of Saul and Jonathan, in the human mind, there would be bloodline dissension there. So it would not go to David. It would go to one of Saul's sons, right? In the same way, especially in biblical times, one would expect the ruler to be one of Jacob or Israel's older sons. But Joseph was one of his younger sons. And Joseph begins to receive these visions of his sons, Jacob's sons, bowing down to him. And he shares this with his family, and they do not react positively to it. Of course, Joseph's brothers are also upset because Jacob loves Joseph more. They're jealous, right? They're jealous of the love that Jacob has for Joseph. They're jealous of the dreams and the future that God has given Joseph. And so, though they are blood kin, they betray Joseph. You know, they throw him in the pit. They sell him to slavery. Of course, in doing so, they could not thwart the plans of God, and Joseph's visions ultimately came to pass. But just notice as you read the scripture how often jealousy is the operative factor. And when I think about jealousy, you know, one thing that comes to mind is the jealousy that a spouse has for their spouse's friends. So, you know, I think we pointed out before that a friend brings something out in someone that perhaps no one else can, right? And it may upset a spouse that their husband or wife, whatever the case may be, is manifesting something about themselves only to that person. And they can see that and become jealous and try to tear that apart. Don't do that. Those friendships are so valuable. And, you know, you have the upper hand as the spouse always. You need to steward it well and affirm your spouse in their friendships that are constructive.
Yeah, I want to go back to the David and Jonathan thing. You said that, you know, jealousy was the thing that Saul had. And what the thing I would like to point out about that is in a friendship, a true biblically based friendship, we need to celebrate the God-appointed role of our friends, even if that God-appointed role exceeds our God-appointed role.
Right.
I mean, Jonathan was not jealous of David, even though he had all rights to be in the human sense. And so, you know, I think a true mark of friendship is when we celebrate the other people's success, especially in a spiritual sense.
Yes.
And, you know, we're both going to have our God-appointed roles in life. Let's celebrate the both of them, even if one exceeds the other.
Yep.
It is a really true friend that is not jealous and celebrates our victories with us in a true, pure way.
I think that you're absolutely right. And I think we need to all ask ourselves the question, when our friend succeeds, when they're on the mountaintop, do we feel that twinge in our heart of hatred, of jealousy of that? Do we feel the urge to tear them down? I mean, it's a sick sort of feeling, but man, that's what it's like to be human, you know. In our pride, we don't like to see others rise, and sometimes even our closest friend, a part of us, can celebrate when they fall. But as you say, a true friend will cry when you cry, laugh when you laugh. And if you find it difficult to celebrate the accomplishments of your friends and to mourn their defeats, that's certainly something worth getting on your knees about and working out with God.